Hi, welcome to this week's episode of the Wellbeing Show. I forgot what I was doing then. It's early in the morning for me. I think I might need more coffee. I'm joined this morning by a psychotherapist, Melanie, who I'll introduce in just one second. Um, just to remind you folks, this is pre-recorded, and if you have any questions, it'd be great to hear from you. So WhatsApp them to me on 07506 319 745. Don't call me because I'll might be out doing something when you watch it. So send me a message. And equally, if you've got any messages or questions for Melanie, send them to me and I can pass them on to her. So with that, let's jump in and say hi, Melanie. How are you doing?
Hi, Noel. Yeah, great to be here. Thank you. I'm doing very well on this very dreary, grey Monday morning. That's why we're recording
It's really wet.
this.
As I said to you, there's arcs floating down my street with
Absolutely.
various animals rushing onto them saying it's the end of time. So really, really wet. But thanks for joining us. And where are you based?
I'm in Guildford in Surrey.
Great. So just south of London, is that right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And on the Downs, is that on the
Yeah, yes, on the south. Oh no, hang on, I'm about to say the wrong thing. The North Downs, I believe. I think of it as being south. East.
yeah, that's very lovely around there, isn't it? Very beautiful. I hope you enjoy that sort of area.
It is. I'm incredibly fortunate to live in such a lovely area and have amazing walking right on my doorstep. So
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing, nature, isn't it? So helpful
absolutely,
and healing for us. So you're a
absolutely.
psychotherapist, is that right? So
Yes.
are you from that area of the world? Is that
So
originally?
I grew up in Claygate near Esher in Surrey, so about kind of half an hour or so from here.
Yeah.
I then went to university up in Durham, and then when I graduated, I moved down to London. I was in Southwest London for about 5 years or so, and then I moved out to here.
Any siblings or just you, sort of?
Yeah, I have one sibling, an older sister.
An older sister, great. And what was it like growing up sort of around that area? Sounds quite idyllic in some ways.
Um, Probably was. And so I think when you're a kid, you probably don't notice all of the stuff that, you very much take for granted, all of the lovely things that we have around us, like nature and so on.
Yeah.
No, I was very fortunate. I think we were always quite an outdoor family, so I was outside
Me and
quite
my
a bit.
brother were quite adventurous together. We used to sort of go off and we were, at that time, it was the first time there was a program came out, which is about a stuntman. It was a series. They've just done a film about it.
Uh-huh.
With Ryan Gosling, I think it is. And
Oh yes, yeah, yeah.
that was originally a television series back when I was a kid. So me and my brother used to go around pretending we were stuntmen and arrive home in various states with our mum just pulling her hair out, going, "What have you done now?" Were you and your
Yeah,
sister close, or sort of had were you and your sister close, or you had separate circles?
probably a mixture of both.
Yeah.
There were some things that, yeah, we were kind of close on, had some shared, interests and hobbies and stuff. But also, I suppose when you're growing up and there's almost 3 years between us, there's also
Right.
time,
That
especially.
feels like an age,
I
doesn't
was
it?
going to say when you're
Younger,
younger,
it's
those
like
those three
now
years
it's
are
like a blink of
significant.
an eye. 3 years, what's that?
Exactly, exactly. So yeah, probably like a lot of people, some moments of closeness and some moments of probably wanting to be as far away as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it all sounds very normal and healthy and very happy, actually, sort of
Yeah.
just getting on with life. And what did you study at Durham? What was your choice?
So I did natural sciences at Durham, which is a kind of combined, so basically a kind of mixture of different sciences. So
Mhm.
I did 4 out of the 6 modules each year were in psychology. So they were
Mhm.
the core psychology modules. And then I also, do you remember exactly what I did do now? The other modules were a mixture of geography and economics that I did there.
It's interesting because I'm sure people don't think about psychology as a science, but of course, there's a lot of evidence behind modern psychological therapies and a lot of research that goes into it.
Absolutely. And I think, that was very much the case actually when I went to university, that not quite sure how to put it so delicately, but psychology wasn't considered, at least by, I think, some people at my school and possibly my parents as well. It wasn't really considered a proper subject, if you like.
Mhm.
I was naturally quite academic at school, and I was always in, maths was my favorite subject and sciences, etc. Um, and the psychology was available at A level, but I was very much encouraged not to take it.
Okay.
And similarly then for degree, but yeah, I found my way there by
So
myself.
did you choose to do it, or was it just because it was part of the syllabus and then you found an interest?
No, so I chose it as part of the natural science. So with the natural sciences course, you could kind of pick, provided the timetables worked really, so you could have done, I don't know, chemistry with maths or
Hmm.
geography or something, or you could do, yeah, psychology with physics and something else.
Yeah.
So
And what was the attraction to psychology? Was there an attraction? It was like you thought,
uh,
oh, just generally, oh, let's try it, or did
no, absolutely. It was always, and it's a really interesting point, really, and it's hard almost to explain. But I think there was this kind of just innate interest in it always, from a fairly young age. Really, I was always fascinated by people.
yeah,
I was often, especially in kind of senior school, I was often the kind of confidant to other friends
sure.
who, things were going on or whatever, and we'd have the kind of the long chats that sometimes teenagers do. And I always enjoyed that, but I was also really interested by it.
Mhm.
And I think that idea of, yeah, working out the world around us really, and no doubt trying to understand myself better as well.
Mm. And were you surprised that it was a science as opposed to, I suppose most people think of it as humanities, wouldn't they? Sort of.
Yeah, and I suppose it's an interesting point. Do we think of it as a social science? I suppose I remember my experience at university. A lot of it in the undergrad felt very much like biology. There
Right.
was a lot around the kind of, say, the physiological structures of the brain, and I seem to remember a lot about the eyes and the optic nerve and things
Mhm.
that I possibly found less interesting. But I remember my two favourite modules, which I think were both in my final year, were child health psychology
Mhm.
and evolutionary psychology.
Mhm.
And both of those really fascinated me because it felt like it was making sense of a lot of the ways that as humans we may um, live, but also that we may struggle.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, those were always the things that really interested me in
I
my
mean,
work.
it's interesting thing because the early pioneers of what we think of as psychology now, Jung, Freud, etc., they claimed, certainly Freud would like to claim a scientific basis for his work, but it's a bit questionable, really, whether there was.
Yeah, yeah,
Very deeply questionable. And the sort of theories that currently persist from that sort of modality. I mean, I have serious questions about that. It's become, it seems, I don't know what your feeling is, and I'm setting myself up for lots of attacks here, I think, but it just seems more like a conversion to a belief system as opposed to a rigorous sort of analysis of evidence.
yeah. I mean, I think it's an important point to, well, for me at least, in the way I work, being an evidence-based practitioner feels very
Right.
important. And I
Okay.
think, to explain what we mean by that, evidence-based in terms of something that you can do scientific research on and you can effectively prove the efficacy of, and that, this is working, and look at what works, really genuinely understand the processes that are going on. And I think now I do not claim in any way to be an expert on Freud. There was, we did do some um, psychodynamic training as part of my
Yeah.
initial my training and my masters that I did. And we were fortunate on that to have a psychoanalyst who came in and taught us. So we did have some of the original readings or some of Freud's original work, I should say. Um, I think, we have access to far more things now. We have fMRI scanners that we can put people in, and we can
Yeah.
understand the brain and what's going on and what areas are lighting up, etc., which wasn't around back then.
Yeah.
So I kind of think, credit where credit's due to Freud and what he was doing, and remembering that the period of time.
Yeah.
And we're now a good, what, 100 and something years on from
Yeah.
that.
I mean, it
And
is
we
quite
now
a
have
long
more, yeah, we have greater means available to us now of understanding these things and of really looking at the science behind it
I
to
mean,
make
it's interesting the attachment with that because I think if I said to somebody, we're going to go with designs that are 100 years old for an aeroplane rather than modern designs,
Yeah.
people would question that and say, I think I might prefer the modern designs, you know. I think you might have learned something about avionics since the Wright brothers, for example. And there's, for me, the same is true in any branch of human knowledge. And the way I like to think about it is this. I remember I was on a radio interview and they were sort of doing that sort of gammon steak stuff, angry white man saying, well, there's all these diagnoses around at the moment. Oh, like this. It's one of those conversations. I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, all right, whatever. And the way I explained it to the interviewer was this, that PTSD really has always existed. It's just not been called that.
Yeah.
So if we go back to World War One, we called it cowardice and we shot people.
Mhm. Yeah.
Now we call it PTSD and we provide evidence-based treatments for trauma called EMDR and various other ones, but EMDR is the most well-known one. And it's the same condition. It's just our understanding of it has changed and our treatment for it has changed and actually improved. And
Yeah.
people are getting caught up in these words as opposed to we're now able to treat conditions that have bedeviled many people. You know,
Yeah.
you think about the number of people that have been in wars, for example, just during the last 100 years. The fact that we've developed better treatment should really be a cause for celebration, should it not? Rather than we still go around and shoot them at dawn for cowardice. It's like,
Absolutely.
seriously, which version of reality do you want?
Yeah.
Is my question. I think, you know, it is an interesting conversation. I don't really wish to get into the controversy of it, but there are certainly evidence-based approaches within psychodynamic thinking. I think of something like interpersonal psychotherapy, which you can get, which is part of NICE guidelines for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression, for example. But that's an updating. Cognitive analytic therapy, again, has taken
Yeah.
some of those ideas and turned it into what we call a manualized therapy. For people who don't know, manualized just means it's in a book. Somebody else can try it out and get the same results of you. That's the basis of scientific method. It's not based upon the personality of the person doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that seem right, Melanie? Is that appropriate to describe it in that way?
Yeah, I think so. I think you probably have a bit more experience on that than I do in terms of the the description of manualized therapies or not. And I think it's
So it just comes in a book and then you can learn it. And that doesn't replace the fact that we need personalities involved, because I think the interpersonal relationship between the therapist and client is really important. It carries it.
absolutely, and I think that's a really key point actually, that it doesn't have to be this kind of either or. And I think there can, we can bring our kind of all of our training around relating and having a very relational approach and a kind of almost humanistic roots to it in our understanding and our way of wanting to be and to care. But yes, I think it's important really that, as I think it's very, very well put by you, who would we want building our airplanes now? Someone working off a model 100 years ago or today? And we have this, the scientific base now that we're fortunate to be in a place, we're privileged to be in a place that we have much greater understanding.
Yeah,
And so
I think
it
so.
makes sense to
I
my
really
mind.
do. Yeah, I think so. And I like you say, I don't think it's either or black and white. We shouldn't get into that sort of camp thinking and but also I guess it is about informing the public. And tell us more about evidence-based practice and your understanding of what that means. You touched upon it briefly, but I think it is those are very important three words.
Yeah, sure. And I think it is, and it's to my mind, I think it is, like I say, kind of aligning ourselves in the way we practice with the most up-to-date research base, what the science tells us, basically. And that doesn't, the reason I was questioning about manualized therapies, I suppose, is I think there's also an element of, considering process sometimes. Well, what is the process that's happening through here, and all of that kind of thing, and often that involves a very personalized approach to these things. Now, there are some, like CBT, I suppose, might be a bit more manualized in that way, of a kind of very, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and it lends itself that way. And there's obviously a huge evidence base for CBT. And I think there's more things coming out, I suppose, like CFT, which I think we're going to talk about a bit later, which is,
I should stop you there, because as professionals, we're just going to go into this spaghetti language.
Sure.
So CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. CFT is compassion focused therapy. We tend to put it into these letters to explain it amongst each other, but I will make a point of putting the full terms. And the interesting thing about these things is that people can research them and look at the evidence for them. So let's continue with the conversation about evidence-based. What does evidence-based mean in this context? What is research in this field, do you think?
So I suppose it's, well, as it would be in many other scientific areas, I imagine. I definitely don't claim to be up to date with the research in other, I
Yeah,
don't know,
yeah.
scientific fields, but
But for
it's
you, having trained in it, what
yeah.
would you
So it's
say?
something
Yeah,
that we can go and I suppose in the same way that, I don't know, it's kind of mind, someone might look up nutrition, right?
yeah,
And you may get people on Instagram telling you what they think about is the best diet or the best nutrition or whatever. And then you might get a dietitian who has been formally trained and is able to engage with the up-to-date research, which is, scientific studies that have been carried out, which we are looking at often with a hypothesis, not always, it depends what type of research you're doing.
yeah,
And we're seeking out to see, well, is this right or not? And that our practice is then led by that, rather than our practice being led by, our own personal experiences, and therefore we see the world through that lens, and that's what we're going to do,
yeah.
or by this is what, kind of feels right or something. There needs to be something, I believe, to back up what we're doing, because otherwise, we can get into slightly dangerous territory, really.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the PTSD example is the clearest one.
Yeah,
We could
absolutely.
still be shooting people for cowardice because of our own personal prejudices. And
Yeah.
some people are still like that in terms of thinking about something like PTSD. Some people would still be quite angry about the idea that somebody would have their mind damaged by traumatic experiences. And you still see that as applied to the civilian population. So, for example, women who have PTSD from domestic abuse situations. And again, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry, I've just brought up a potentially triggering subject. And so I just want to not apologize for it, but just say it is a potentially triggering subject. There is help if you're in intimate partner violence situations. All local authorities provide support services, and there are organisations, women's organisations that will provide help for you. So just Google it, and you'll find help for it. You're not alone in this, but do get professional help because it's a damaging situation. So, there are still, my point was that there are still people who get angry about these things and label them. And I guess my feeling about evidence is this. I can point to it and say, this is what informs my thinking. Can you show me what informs your thinking?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Right?
And that's the really key thing. And I think especially in today's world, where there are many benefits to being able to speak, on social media or in general, that we have so much information at our fingertips, but we just need to be mindful about, like you say, what's behind that information. And I think actually your point around PTSD, or potentially people feeling angry about that as a kind of label, I suppose one distinction maybe that's worth making is that evidence-based practice doesn't necessarily mean diagnosis. In fact,
Yes.
it very much doesn't. And I think diagnosis can be a very tricky thing for a lot of people. And I'm always interested with clients. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I can't diagnose anyone anyway. But if they come to me either with a diagnosis or they're wondering about a diagnosis, I think the important thing is what that diagnosis means to that person. So for some people, a psychiatric diagnosis can feel very affirming, very validating,
Yeah.
very removing of shame that they may feel around something, and it makes sense of it, of like, well, actually, this isn't me, this is this problem, or this, some people might say it's an illness that I have or something. Other people, it can be the opposite, that actually it feels very shaming. It feels like there's a label and it's proving there's something wrong with me. I always said there was something wrong with me, and now I've got this, and it shows that there is. So
And
it's
there are sort of belief systems that come into diagnoses as well. You will know this yourself, and there's have been issues around diagnostic manuals over the years. And
Absolutely.
for example, it used to be considered a pathology if you were gay. Now we wouldn't consider it a pathology at all. And it's quite clearly that was somebody's prejudice. But again, my feeling is that if we work with an evidence base, we're more likely to be able to challenge those things than if we work with prejudice and belief systems.
Absolutely.
So it's
Absolutely.
really about moving out of belief systems into what we can test.
Yeah.
Have a methodology to test and share with other people. And that's why sharing our findings with other people in whatever form it comes, I think is quite important because people can look at it critically, our peers, and say, yeah, I found the same thing, or no, I found something different, actually. Let's have a look at that and have a conversation. Um, my my sense is that I would say to the public that know where your therapist is coming from. And sort of like, if they're not able to explain why they're doing something. So, for example, with my clients, I will point to the NICE guidelines, for example, and say NICE is the National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence, and say, well, it says in here the evidence is quite clear that we try this with that. And it doesn't mean we always stick with them because they're guidelines and we can choose to move outside of them if necessary. But we would choose that together as an informed decision.
Yeah.
Um, so you study as an undergraduate and then you went on to be a psychotherapist, or what was the next step for you?
No, so no, I started off my professional career as working within commodities trading.
Okay.
So very different. So I did
A very mathematical and formula based as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it was so I did it. It was this kind of 2 year graduate scheme that I went on to initially, which involved working in a few different areas of the company,
Yeah.
in kind of in the finance teams and in the risk management teams. And then I was very fortunate. I was moved to Houston for a short term expat to kind of experience some things out there, and then I came back to a trading role in London.
Yeah.
Um, and I really loved parts of it, and I think it suited a lot of parts. I mean, it's interesting when now I kind of see some similarities in a way between areas, some things around trading and therapy, which I think people often scratch their heads about. But
Mhm.
I think, it's that kind of being very present, and things um, can feel stressful sometimes. There can be a lot going on, but that ability to actually really stay calm and present and and act in a way that I suppose that you want to in those moments.
Yeah.
I then, though, I had a kind of, in my, I suppose, kind of mid to late 20s, made some kind of big lifestyle changes, got very into kind of health and fitness for a period. And that, I think, really changed my outlook on some things and made me think that actually, I don't know if I want to be sat behind 6 screens for 12-hour days and, kind of living off your nerves a bit sometimes and being judged, you good or bad trader based on how much money you made or lost in the last trade kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be outdoors more again. I wanted to have the freedom to do, the things that I was enjoying at the time. So that's when I decided actually to leave that profession, and I had a kind of brief foray through the fitness industry and then some kind of coaching work. And that was a really interesting one because I realized that, again, it wasn't quite it for me. That the thing I was always really interested in was the psychology behind things, but also, I'd meet people who would be talking about really serious struggles, and I felt ethically I wasn't qualified to deal with them.
Yes. Yes.
But I wanted to be. That I realized that was the stuff I was actually really interested in, and I was fortunate that a kind of situation presented itself to me that meant I could go and do some project management work for a kind of smaller company, which gave me time to just step back a second and think, what do I actually really want to do here?
Mm.
And that was when I then decided to retrain and do my master's as a psychotherapist.
Okay. Where did you do that? Just out of interest.
That was at Roehampton.
Okay. And what was the course? Again, just out of interest.
It was integrative counselling and psychotherapy. So it was a 3-year master's course, and I did a year before that, just my levels 1 to 3 in counselling skills as well at Guildford College.
And integrative means it blends from everything?
Yeah, so there were 3 main approaches that were spoken about on that, or spoken about, taught on that course. So person-centered, CBT, and psychodynamic.
Okay.
And yeah, integrating is basically, finding your own kind of way of working, of integrating things from different approaches.
Yeah.
To be able to then, I suppose, kind of, personalize your approach more to the person you're working with, to what's going to be helpful. Although even, quite early on in that, I had an interest in CFT, and I was started to do trainings external to the course whilst I was still actually training as doing the masters.
And it's interesting, we're not necessarily going to go into it, but I think there's an interesting conversation about personal exposure maybe to have as well as a professional in the helping professions. And people, again, there's something about the psychological helping professions, and you mentioned psychiatry, which is a medical profession, but also a psychological profession, and somehow it crosses both. But you went through a period of questioning your life. We don't need to go into that, but maybe it brings up the conversation about what is it appropriate to share, and that idea of, the relationship being very important with our clients, and how that relationship is defined and shaped. I mean, in terms of that sort of conversation, we began to talk about it before the show. Where are you at, do you think, in terms of disclosure, warmth, presence? I guess compassion is something you're interested in because you're trained in it. So,
and I think it's a really, as we kind of started to get into a little bit before the show, it's a really interesting topic, and I think there's, I suppose a more kind of traditional approach can often talk about in therapy of kind of a non-self-disclosure from the therapist. And definitely throughout my training, I felt that was a bit of a
Freud, we talked about Freud earlier, he very much advocated the blank screen. He was never a blank himself, we know from the reports, but the theoretical model was the blank screen, sit behind the person, they project all their anxieties. We now know from evidence that it doesn't necessarily project any neurosis. It's a response to a very anxious, provoking situation. Really.
Exactly that. And I think that's, something I love about CFT, compassion focused therapy, is it's really rooted in evolutionary psychology and understanding how we have evolved, and using that then to inform the way that we work. And a big thing with that is understanding our threat system and things that can push us into that threat system and activate that kind of that sympathetic branch of our nervous system. And when we think about things like blank faces, right, blank face experiment, where you can Google it, it'll be on YouTube, there'll be clips of a mum interacting with her baby, everything's happy, then turning away, coming back blank. Baby will become very distressed.
Absolutely, within instantaneously.
We are social creatures. We have evolved for social connection. It is a fundamental need.
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? Thinking about what a baby is born with, the 4 things: grasping, rooting, sucking, tracking, smiling. Right? A to-be born baby, a fetus, will practice smiling in the womb. Why? Because it's about social engagement, social interaction. Tracking is finding human faces, looking at them, and then smiling at them, because that's a basic survival mechanism that's encoded into our amygdala. You talked about the threat mechanism, but it's facial recognition is part of a bit of the brain called the amygdala, just for people to understand. And the amygdala is the core of our threat mechanism. It goes whether something's friendly or not. And we have a perceptive response to faces, don't we, as well? We can actually sense whether a face is aggressive or friendly before we actually visually see it. That's correct, isn't it?
Which is incredible.
Isn't that extraordinary?
The skills that, like you say, that babies have, you're talking about even kind of when we're still in the womb, or we're in utero. That we are so, and I think this is something that really can't be emphasized enough, we are so primed for social connection, and it is as needed as our physical needs. I don't you heard the kind of the wire monkey experiment?
Oh yeah, the Harris et al.
So I always
I don't like talking about it because it's like the basis of attachment, the science of attachment. It's also vivisection as well. It's sort of
quite sad to watch.
It's like the story about what happened to Pavlov's dogs. They were messed up. They were destroyed. He destroyed them. So, but you're right. Please carry on with the.
Well, so I think it's a helpful way sometimes for people to really understand that. I think, there's still so much stigmatizing language around this idea of, I don't know, we might talk about children or adults, right, as being like needy or attention seeking or whatever it might be. And actually to really take a step back and understand like that we are all needy because we all have needs and we all need
Yeah,
attention. And so the wire monkey experiment is this, the I can't remember the dates when it was now, a little while ago, but the premise of it. So monkey in a cage, there's wire, a monkey made out of wire, chicken wire or something,
yeah,
and a mummy monkey which has milk, and then there's basically like a fluffy cuddly toy monkey,
yeah,
and the baby monkey will always go to the fluffy cuddly toy monkey to cling on and feel safe
yeah,
over going and getting the milk from the cold wire monkey.
yeah.
And I think it just shows, as I mean, we're not monkeys now, but we evolved from primates, that need for social connection in order to feel safe.
Yeah.
A
So
newborn baby
it might be
completely.
useful to, because I think it is a really important set of experiments, although, because the next step was this, wasn't it? Essentially, what was happening was that these newborn monkeys, these baby monkeys, were being frightened in the cage. So they'd go and shout at them and they'd
Mhm,
go and seek comfort
mhm.
on this warm, furry thing. So they cling to the fur, grasping, rooting, sucking, kind
Yeah,
of the same primate response that we have as newborn babies.
yeah.
Now, the ones that were allowed the warm fur were able to integrate into socializing with the monkey group afterwards.
Mhm,
The
mhm.
ones that were given the wire were not able to.
Yeah,
They were almost permanently damaged. And that's really important part of the story, I think, is when I say
absolutely.
to people, what do you think happens if you don't give the comfort? What seriously, what do you really think will happen? Well, we already know what will happen. We've got and it's very rarely talked about. We've got these experiments and Pavlov's dogs as well. If you want to go and Google that, what were they like after he'd finished messing around with them,
Yeah, absolutely.
electrocuting them? They were unable to socialize. They had to be institutionalized for the rest of their life. What happens to children that we do that to?
Mm.
They are unable to be part of society. They end up in institutions. Traumatized children end up in institutions for the
Mhm.
rest of their life, or in some form of care, whether it's prison, whether it's hospital, etc., etc. We know that there have been plenty of studies in the Soviet Union from their group home experiences, which you know about, you're referencing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's that idea of that kind of failure to thrive, right? And
Yeah,
it's really, really, I think, distressing evidence we've seen from kind of Romanian orphanages as well, where
absolutely.
children are not given those, well, those needs aren't met for them, um, and it can be catastrophic, the effects.
Um, what's
Sorry.
the connection here with adults? Because that bit of the brain functioning, that need never goes away. It's a permanently hardwired part of human
Also,
experience.
Noel, I just lost the sound there for a second. Sorry,
Are
I
you
heard what's the connection with adults, and
okay?
then you
Yeah,
were
are you
still.
back with us?
I
Don't
think
worry.
so.
There we
Yeah,
go. Live experience.
yeah,
So people might say, fair enough, that's children, but as adults, surely we get out of it. I would suggest that we don't, because that's a hardwired bit of us that allows us for the rest of our life to form new relationships with people.
yeah.
The fact that we're vulnerable, we manage that vulnerability, and we have that desire to explore the world, all comes from that nurturing experience, right?
Absolutely. And I think, you could look at this through kind of attachment theory. And also I think this understanding. So in CFT, we talk about a three system model
Okay.
of kind of emotional processing. And one of those, some people might call it the three circle model, is that threat system. And a key thing about this is understanding the motives. So our threat system, generally, the motive is around safety
Yeah.
seeking or protection, right? Getting safe. And if we grow up in an environment where our needs aren't met and
Mhm.
we're not feeling safe, now that might be physical safety, if there's physical abuse going on, but also emotional safety, feeling loved, feeling that somebody understands us, feeling that warmth from a parent. If that's not there, our brains are going to be very, very clever on our behalf, and they will develop safety seeking strategies,
Mm-hmm.
which, similarly might be known as kind of, defense mechanisms and more psychodynamics thing, or kind of coping modes and schema work, something like that. This is kind of like it's in a way, sometimes I think of it almost with people like it's kind of how we've learned to live in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's, we grow up in a very difficult environment and we feel maybe unloved by our parents, or there's a lot of volatility around us, we may go searching for that way to find safety in any number of ways. Now, that might look like becoming what some people might call kind of a people pleaser, or something like really kind of trying to adapt the way we are in order to please others. We may develop a strong kind of hypervigilance, which means we're always watching what's going on around us. Mm-hmm. We're waiting for whenever the next argument might kick off. Mm-hmm. There's all these different ways that we can learn to try to feel safe, and it's an unconscious thing. It's not something we're consciously aware of as kids. Mm-hmm. We will effectively keep kind of playing off the same script until that's updated. Yeah. And that's the key thing about how that then impacts us in adulthood. So what we often think about when we're looking at this in CFT is this idea of unintended consequences. Mm. So what are the safety strategies that developed that worked really well at the time, worked in terms of they served a function, they helped us to feel safer at the time. Mm-hmm. But what are the unintended consequences? That means, that might mean that there are certain dynamics that play out in relationships now as adults that actually have unintended consequences and are harmful to us rather than helpful. Yeah. It might mean that, we use substances, we use alcohol, drugs, food, I don't know, we use porn or sex or whatever it might be, right? That at the time we developed these things, they served a function, and they probably do still serve a function, and that's a really important piece of it. It's we're getting something from it, but then there's all these unintended consequences that can actually cause huge harm and suffering to us. And I think that's one of the really key things of linking this idea of what happened back here that is now continuing to affect us in the present, and how can we kind of effectively update that.
And so thinking about within the context of safety in the relationship with the therapist, which is where we started, I guess, and thinking about disclosure or not disclosure, what's your thinking around that now in terms of relationship forming? I mean, we know a lot about the sort of frontal lobes, which is essentially what you're talking about, how personality changes, particularly in the face of distress. We're dealing with distress. So what's your thinking around it now? I know you haven't formulated any conclusions, but... So
I think in the therapy room, as it were, I think appropriate self-disclosure from the therapist can actually be very helpful. And at worst, I'm saying, I think this, there is an evidence base backing that up. We're seeing that, and it's something that is spoken about in CFT, this idea, we have to be a real human. Right. Now that there's got to be boundaries there, and we need to be professional. But if we understand relating and those emotional needs, it requires two human beings in the room. And, we may not go into the details of our own life or our own suffering, because I think there's, we would need to be really careful here that therapy is about the needs of the client. It is not about the needs of the therapist. Therapists have needs, but those should be met elsewhere, supervision, personal therapy, personal relationships, whatever, right? But absolutely, I think to be able to share with our clients, do you know what, actually, I have really struggled as well. And I get this, or this is how it's impacted me. That for some clients, that can be so helpful, because I think also we sometimes put our therapists on a bit of a pedestal and imagine everything is kind of completely worked out.
Therapists like to put themselves on a pedestal. Right. I'm more comfortable up there. Don't come anywhere near me.
Well, it's interesting actually you say that. So I did some research into therapists' experience of using CFT for complex trauma, and I remember one of the therapists I spoke to talking about how much more vulnerable she had to be using CFT than some other models that she had used before. because absolutely there is this kind of getting on the field with our clients in a way. And like I say, not making it about us, but actually being like, yeah, this happens. And there's something about that I think can be very de-shaming and really bring in the kind of common humanity element that so often I think, we can feel like we're the only one who's ever felt this way.
Yeah.
We're the only one who's messed up this much, or, is this awful person. And actually to be able to, in a safe, containing context here, that, well, no, actually you're not.
Yeah.
I felt this way as well. And other people have that common humanity part is really, really important.
Yeah. And it's a core process of recovery, I think, is this idea of normalizing.
Absolutely.
You're not weird or strange. You're not on Mars. You're having an understandable response to a really distressing situation.
Absolutely.
And human beings do that, and that's what happens. And again, I like your explanation of how we how our mind, or our brains in this context really, create patterns of behavior from early days, which later on, out of context, no longer make sense. Now, because they formed earlier on, it often leaves us feeling like there's something really quite weird about ourselves as individuals, right?
Yeah.
But actually understanding it in that context, we go, oh, it's not weird. It's just an unhelpful pattern.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually that feeling of us being the problem, that in itself may have served a function at some point in time.
Yes.
Because, like I say, as young children, even as teenagers, really, we are still reliant on our parents, and we have very little agency or autonomy then. We don't choose who our parents are. We don't choose where we live. We don't choose where we go to school. We don't choose our teachers. We don't, all of these things. And actually, it might sound kind of paradoxical, but seeing ourselves as the problem in itself can be a kind of
it doesn't sound paradoxical to me. It makes absolute sense. It really does.
What's the alternative?
Because we can go back to that Harris et al. Thinking about the monkeys that weren't given the warm furry thing to cling to, who then went into the monkey group and couldn't socialize. It's a response that they've got, clearly. It's not because of them.
Yeah.
Because of what's happened.
And that's I think, the really key thing. Like, this is actually so much of the suffering that we experience as humans in terms of psychological suffering is an appropriate response to the things we have experienced. It's not this inherent problem that lives within us. The problem is out there. It's what's happened, and then how our nervous system and brain have responded to what has happened to us.
And the exciting thing about that for me is, and again, it comes to that diagnostic medical versus psychological model. Not that there's much versus, but it's interesting to think about it. So the exciting thing for me as a human being, when I first heard that, when I continue to hear that, is I mean, if that's because of things shaping me, then surely that the conclusion makes sense that then things now could shape me in a different way. I can change.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that like you say, it's a really interesting, this idea of kind of psychiatric model versus, although we don't necessarily want to get into competition, but a more psychological model, right, of understanding these things as a response to something, and therefore if we change the stimulus, the conditions, that can also then change. Now I think we want to be a little bit careful in not that sometimes it can be that can still be very complex things. But I don't want people to feel further shame of kind of, well, that hasn't, I've changed things, but I'm still the same kind of thing.
We have to draw sharp dividing lines of things like if you've got a medical condition, CFS is a good example, isn't it? Chronic fatigue syndrome was for a long time battered by psychology. It's all in your mind. It's not. It's a blood-brain barrier problem, and it needs medical help, along with a lot of those chronic conditions. It's the same with ASD, autistic spectrum disorder, was originally thought of by Bettelheim, I think, as the result of cold mothering, the fridge theory of mothering. It's not. But there's definite issues around neurodiversity, etc., etc. And so, but again, that comes back to evidence-based practice to me. that if we look at the evidence, and like, for example, with anybody who comes into my practice who says they have anxiety or depression, we're going to be talking to the GP and checking the thyroid gland isn't messed up and that they don't need a bit of medication, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So there is a division, but it's interesting to think about that there's a lot of hope because we went over medicalized,
Yeah.
and that sort of meant that only a tablet could do it.
Yeah. And I think the key thing with that hopes, I think absolutely I suppose what I was thinking about now, what I was kind of thinking about was that sometimes we need more than just changing the conditions around. In fact, I'd say oftentimes we need more than changing the conditions around us.
Yeah.
There are certain processes and things that we may want to go through. So, I think psychoeducation is a really important one. What we've been talking about, this idea of understanding ourselves, understanding where our struggles come from.
Yeah.
But then we also need to learn how to work with our physiology, working with our nervous system, with our brain, to create new states in ourselves, to get familiar. For a lot of people, the idea of actually getting into that parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, what we make as rest and digest, sorry. And in CFT, we talk about kind of the green system, the soothing affiliative system.
Yeah.
That in itself can actually be very threatening for people, because if it's one, it's unknown for some people, so it can feel very alarming. Also, depending what's happened, the experience of actually feeling safe, feeling connected to another, may have now become linked with threats. So if someone has been abused, within relationships, sexual abuse, physical abuse, something, and it's at those moments we feel close to someone that actually the abuse is going to happen, it can be a really complex field. And so I think just
absolutely
making that
again brings us back to that conversation about disclosure, because we do need to know something about the background of the person that we're working with. And if the patient we're working with, the person we're working with, the client, the human that we're working with, has had a history of people in positions of power and authority, parents, partners, etc., emotional authority, taking advantage of that. So to going too soon into trying to form a warm relationship would indeed be threatening.
Absolutely.
Unintended consequence. And we know it from, say, attachment theory, and we talk about frozen attachments. So kids who experience violence from a parent have what we call frozen attachment. So they desperately need the attachment, but they're also afraid. And so they get literally caught. I think it's about, is it 4 feet? There's a sort of actual physical space where they're frozen and they can't go towards and they can't run away because they're desperately caught in between. And you can watch young children do that. So we do need to be aware, as you say. But fundamentally, I guess your point would be that what we're trying to get to is that natural way of relating as a human being, the one that we were given in utero.
Yeah, absolutely.
Most of us, right? And get to engaging with those processes in our current everyday life. Would that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And to start to learn what it is to actually feel safe in our body and in ourselves.
Yeah.
And from that place then to be able to relate to others and again to ourselves in different ways that might be very different to what we've experienced thus far in our life.
Yeah. So tell me about where we're getting towards the end, just giving you a heads up. We've got a couple of minutes left. So tell me about, very briefly, headlines on the history of compassion-focused therapy, where it comes from.
So compassion-focused therapy, CFT, was founded by, and is still very much involved, a wonderful man called Paul Gilbert. Now I believe this is going to be testing my knowledge a little bit to make sure I've got it right in his personal history, but my understanding, he originally trained, he's a clinical psychologist, he originally trained quite a lot in CBT, he trained with Beck, but he also has always had a great interest in evolutionary psychology. And so CFT now is what we call a biopsychosocial model, so considers our biology, our psychology, and the social factors of our life. And like I say, it's got a lot of roots in evolutionary psychology, of really understanding, how we have evolved as humans, as mammals, a really important thing to consider in that
as a species.
Yeah, exactly. and how that then influences us today, understanding, our physiology as much as our psychology. I mean, I think the two are so integrated, or so.
I don't make a distinction, but you're right. Yeah.
And so then, yes, so it's been about the last probably 20 to 30 years that CFT has been around, and the evidence base has been growing throughout all of that time. And I think it's there's some really exciting stuff coming out in the science now of how effective some of these things can be. And especially, so there's kind of within CFT, compassion focused therapy, therapeutic process itself. There's also CMT, which is the compassionate mind training. And that might be more kind of exercises or certain things that we might do. So it still includes that psychoeducation, understanding things, three-circle models, etc. But then also specific exercises to work with our physiology, I say with our body, and using imagery for certain things. And that will form part of the therapy. But it also might be for some people that actually going through that compassionate mind training can really help them in and of itself. And I think that's a really key thing is, where's the line? And this isn't known yet in the research, but where's the line between people who can be helped actually just by effectively a bit more of a kind of curriculum, as it were, versus the therapeutic processes that are needed. And I think a big thing is what we call kind of FBRs, fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion. And we're probably going to need a whole nother podcast to properly go into CFT, which is what I love speaking about. But it's really, like I say, kind of looking at or understanding how we are as a human, including all of our body and our physiology, and how we can then work with that in order to move forwards, and what's required. In that. So it's a wonderful, if there's any practitioners as well listening to this, I'd really recommend checking it out. It's a wonderful community. Paul is still very active in it. Now, at least, and he's in his 70s now, but it's genuinely really amazing people trying to do good in the world.
We have sadly come to the end. Is there a website where people get hold of you, or social media platforms? So
my website is melanieharrispsychotherapy.com. And all of my contact details are on there.
Okay. Look, Melanie, I know that this is relatively new area for you, coming on these programs and in social media, and I know you had some thoughts and anxieties about it, but I really want to thank you for taking the risk and joining us today and giving us such a sort of warm and insightful look at yourself, but also about your practice and what's informed your growth and as a person and as a professional. I do see there being connections between what we do personally and professionally, in the same way that I think mind and body are the same thing, but we have to be, as professionals, open to the idea that we act on our own pathologies as much as we act on our good things.
Absolutely.
And be open to challenging that. And I think that's right. That's absolutely right. Modeling that, as you've done so well today, I think is some of the most healing things that we can do. Modeling, being a complicated human, just doing the best they can, right?
Absolutely.
We are.
Whether we've trained as a therapist or not, we're all just human beings.
That's right. Just trying to do the best you can. Thank you for joining us. Stay there as I say goodbye to people. I hope you really enjoyed it. Do reach out. Check out Melanie, MelanieHarrisPsychotherapy.com. Check out her website, or send me a message, 07506 319 745. I'll pass it on to her. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we will definitely bring you back another time to go a bit more of a deep dive into the technicalities of the work as well. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you all have a great time wherever you are. Bye bye for now.